The golden envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. Inside, embossed on cream-colored paper that whispered of old money and older traditions, was an invitation that would have meant everything to me 12 months ago and meant something entirely different today. The Metropolitan Arts Council cordially invites you to serve as Honorary Chair of our annual Patrons Gala. It read in elegant script, "Your visionary leadership and commitment to cultural excellence make you the perfect choice to guide this year's celebration of artistic achievement." I set the invitation down on my mahogany desk and smiled, not with pleasure, but with the kind of irony that comes from watching the universe reveal its sense of humor. 12 months ago, I had been Dr. Sophia Chen, a struggling arts administrator with a PhD in museum studies and a salary that barely covered my student loans. I had applied to be a junior committee member for this very gala, hoping that volunteer work might open doors in the insular world of high society philanthropy. They had declined my application. Not just declined, dismissed it with the kind of polite condescension that made it clear I didn't belong in their rarefied circle of cultural gatekeepers. Now I was Sophia Chen, CEO of Meridian Cultural Enterprises, the largest arts funding corporation in the region, and the company that had just acquired the exclusive sponsorship rights to every major cultural event in the city, including the Metropolitan Arts Council's annual Patrons Gala. Ms. Chen, my assistant Marcus Rivera, appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing. "The delegation from the Metropolitan Arts Council is here for your meeting. Should I show them to the conference room?" "Actually," I said, picking up the invitation and feeling its expensive weight between my fingers, "let's meet in my office. I think they'll appreciate the view." The view from my office was spectacular floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic vista of the city's cultural district. From here, I could see the Metropolitan Museum, the Symphony Hall, the Contemporary Arts Center, and a dozen smaller galleries and theaters. All of them now depended, directly or indirectly, on funding from my company. Ms. Chen, Margaret Whitmore, swept into my office with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of social prominence. She was followed by Harrison Blackwood, the Arts Council's chairman, and Victoria Ashworth, their development director. These were the same people who had reviewed my volunteer application a year ago and found me wanting. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice," Margaret continued, settling into one of the leather chairs facing my desk. "I trust you received our invitation." "I did," I said, holding up the envelope. "Though, I have to admit, I was surprised by it." "Surprised?" Victoria's eyebrows rose with practiced elegance. "Surely you understand that someone of your stature and influence would be a natural choice for honorary chair. Your company's commitment to the arts is exactly what we need to elevate this year's event." The irony was so thick I could taste it. These were the same people who had questioned my commitment to the arts when I'd applied to volunteer. Now that I controlled their funding, my commitment was suddenly unquestionable. "I appreciate the invitation," I said carefully, "but I'm curious about the timing. The gala is only 6 weeks away. Isn't it unusual to select an honorary chair so late in the planning process?" Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, we had originally planned to proceed with our existing leadership structure, but recent developments in the cultural funding landscape have made us reconsider our approach." "Recent developments," I repeated. "You mean my company's acquisition of the major sponsorship contracts, among other things?" "Yes." Margaret's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, careful enough to avoid commitment. "Your influence in the cultural sector has grown so significantly that we felt it would be remiss not to invite your direct participation in our signature event." I leaned back in my chair, studying the three faces before me. A year ago, these people had been cultural royalty, the arbiters of artistic taste and philanthropic virtue. Now they sat in my office like supplicants, their power diminished by the simple reality that I controlled the resources they needed to maintain their relevance. "I have to ask," I said, "what changed your minds about my suitability for leadership roles in the arts community?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment, and I saw recognition dawn in her eyes. She remembered Minot as the successful CEO sitting across from her now, but as the eager young woman whose volunteer application had been rejected. "I'm not sure I understand," Margaret said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she understood perfectly. "Last year," I continued, "I applied to serve on the junior committee for this very gala. I was told that my background and experience didn't align with the Arts Council's standards for volunteer leadership. I was told that the committee required individuals with established connections in the philanthropic community and demonstrated commitment to cultural excellence." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face had gone pale, Victoria was staring at her hands, and Margaret was clearly calculating the implications of what I'd just revealed. "I'm sure there was some misunderstanding," Margaret finally said. "The volunteer selection process can be quite competitive, and there was no misunderstanding," I interrupted gently. "I have the rejection letter right here." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder that contained not just the Arts Council's rejection, but similar dismissals from a dozen other cultural organizations. I had kept them all not out of bitterness, but as reminders of the barriers I'd faced and the motivation they'd provided. "While we appreciate your interest in supporting the arts," I read from the letter, "we feel that your background in academic administration may not provide the perspective we're seeking for this particular role. We encourage you to consider other volunteer opportunities that might be more suited to your experience level." I set the letter down on my desk where all three visitors could see it. "The letter is signed by you, Mrs. Whitmore, in your capacity as volunteer coordinator." Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "Sophia, Ms. Chen, I'm sure that if there were oversights in our volunteer selection process, we can address them. The Arts Council is always looking for ways to be more inclusive and welcoming." "Inclusive and welcoming," I repeated. Interesting choice of words. Because when I applied last year, I had a PhD in museum studies from Yale, 5 years of experience managing cultural programs, and a published research record on arts accessibility. But apparently, that wasn't enough to qualify me for volunteer work. "What has changed," I continued, "is not my qualifications or my commitment to the arts. What has changed is my bank account and my ability to write large checks. Suddenly, my perspective is valuable. Suddenly, my leadership is desired. Suddenly, I belong in your world." Harrison cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. "Ms. Chen, I think there may have been some miscommunication about your qualifications. If we had understood the depth of your expertise, you did understand," I said firmly. "You understood perfectly. You just didn't care, because expertise without wealth is invisible in your world. Knowledge without connections is worthless in your circles. Passion without a trust fund is irrelevant to your mission." Victoria finally found her voice. "That's not fair, Sophia. The Arts Council has always been committed to supporting emerging professionals in the cultural sector, has it?" I turned to my computer and pulled up a document I'd been preparing for months. "I've done some research on the Arts Council's leadership over the past decade. Would you like to see what I found?" The document was a comprehensive analysis of the Arts Council's board composition, volunteer leadership, and funding priorities. The data told a clear story and organization that claimed to champion diversity and inclusion while maintaining a leadership structure that was overwhelmingly white, wealthy, and well-connected. 93% of your board members attended private universities. I read 87% inherited their wealth rather than earning it. 74% live in the same 5 zip codes, and 100% of your honorary chairs over the past 10 years have been selected based on their social connections rather than their cultural expertise. The numbers were damning, but they were also unsurprising. The Arts Council, like so many cultural institutions, had become a closed system that perpetuated its own exclusivity while claiming to serve the broader community. These statistics, I continued, represent more than just demographic imbalances. They represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what cultural leadership should look like in the 21st century. Margaret was clearly struggling to regain control of the conversation. Sophia, we appreciate your research and we're certainly open to discussing ways to improve our organizational diversity. But right now, we're hoping to focus on this year's gala and your potential role as honorary chair. My potential role, I said, savoring the phrase. Let me ask you something, Mrs. Whitmore. If I hadn't built a successful company, if I hadn't acquired control of your funding sources, would you be here today asking for my leadership? The question was rhetorical, but I waited for an answer anyway. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. I thought not, I said finally. Which brings me to my response to your invitation. I picked up the elegant invitation and held it for a moment. Feeling the weight of everything, it represented the exclusion I'd faced, the barriers I'd overcome, and the power I now possessed to change the system that had rejected me. I'm declining your invitation to serve as honorary chair, I said, but I'm not declining it because I'm too busy or because I lack interest in the arts. I'm declining it because accepting would validate a system that values wealth over wisdom, connections over competence, and privilege over passion. The three visitors sat in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for a rejection they hadn't considered possible. However, I continued, I do have a counterproposal. As the primary sponsor of this year's gala, Meridian Cultural Enterprises will be hosting our own event the same evening. We're calling it the Future of Arts Leadership Summit, and it will bring together emerging cultural professionals, community artists, and innovative thinkers who are actually shaping the future of the arts. You're hosting a competing event. Harrison's voice carried a note of panic that he couldn't quite suppress. I'm hosting an alternative event, I corrected. One that celebrates the kind of cultural leadership that your organization has consistently overlooked. One that demonstrates what the arts community could look like if it were actually inclusive, innovative, and focused on impact rather than image. Margaret leaned forward, her diplomatic mask slipping to reveal something closer to desperation. Sophia, surely we can work together on this. The Arts Council and Meridian Cultural Enterprises should be partners, not competitors. We could have been partners, I agreed. 12 months ago, when I applied to volunteer my time and expertise in service of your mission. But you chose exclusion over collaboration, gatekeeping over growth, tradition over transformation. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cultural district that had once seemed so inaccessible and now lay spread before me like a kingdom. I'd conquered, through sheer determination, the invitation you sent me today, I said without turning around, isn't an invitation to leadership. It's an invitation to legitimize a system that has outlived its usefulness. And I'm not interested in being your token diverse leader or your convenient corporate sponsor. I'm interested in building something better. When I turned back to face them, I saw three people grappling with the realization that the world they'd dominated for so long was changing, and that the change was being driven by someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant just 12 months before. The invitation had come too late. The power had already shifted, and the future of arts leadership was about to be redefined by the very people they'd spent decades excluding from their exclusive circle. After the Arts Council delegation left my office, their departure marked by strained pleasantries and barely concealed panic, found myself alone with the weight of what I'd just set in motion. The city stretched out below me, its cultural institutions gleaming in the afternoon sun like chess pieces on a board where I just declared checkmate. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. The Times is calling. Word is already spreading about your counter event. They want a statement. I wasn't surprised. In the insular world of cultural philanthropy, news traveled faster than gossip at a society luncheon. By evening, every arts organization in the city would know that their largest sponsor had just declared war on the establishment that had ruled their world for generations. Ms. Chen, Dr. Alina Rodriguez, appeared in my doorway, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. As Meridian's director of cultural programs, she had been instrumental in developing our alternative vision for arts leadership. She was also one of the many talented professionals who had been systematically excluded from traditional cultural institutions despite her impressive credentials. "How did it go?" she asked, settling into one of the chairs recently vacated by the Arts Council leadership. "About as expected," I said, returning to my desk. "They offered me the honorary chair position. I declined, and I announced our competing event. They left looking like they'd just watched their world end." "In a way, they did," Elena observed. "The old model of cultural leadership, where social connections mattered more than actual expertise, it's not sustainable anymore. Your success has proven that." I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months ago, I had been struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment while working multiple part-time positions in the cultural sector. My expertise in museum studies and arts administration was extensive, but it was also invisible to the gatekeepers who controlled access to meaningful opportunities. The breakthrough had come when I'd developed a digital platform that connected emerging artists with potential patrons, bypassing the traditional gallery system entirely. What started as a side project, born of frustration, had evolved into a revolutionary approach to arts funding that attracted millions in venture capital and transformed me from an outsider to an industry leader. "Elena," I said, "I want you to be completely honest with me. Are we doing the right thing here? Are we changing a broken system, or are we just replacing one form of exclusion with another?" She considered the question carefully before responding. "I think we're doing what the Arts Council should have done years ago, creating space for voices that have been systematically silenced. The difference is that we're not excluding people based on their background or connections. We're including people based on their ideas and their impact. But we are excluding the traditional power structure. We're challenging it," Elena corrected. "There's a difference. If Margaret Whitmore or Harrison Blackwood wanted to participate in our summit based on their expertise and vision rather than their social status, they'd be welcome. But they'd have to compete on merit rather than rely on inherited privilege." My computer chimed with an email notification. The sender was Victoria Ashworth, and the subject line read, "Urgent, reconsideration of partnership opportunities." I opened the message and read, "Victoria's carefully worded attempt to salvage the relationship between the Arts Council and Meridian Cultural Enterprises." She suggested a collaborative approach that would honor both traditional excellence and innovative perspectives. Between the diplomatic language, I could read the desperation of an organization that had suddenly realized its survival depended on the goodwill of someone they'd previously dismissed. "They're panicking," I said, showing Elena the email. "Victoria is trying to negotiate some kind of compromise that would allow them to save face while still accessing art funding." "What are you going to tell her?" "Nothing, for now. Let them sit with the uncertainty for a while. Let them understand what it feels like to have their future depend on someone else's decisions, someone they've underestimated and undervalued." My phone rang, displaying a number I recognized as belonging to James Morrison, the director of the Contemporary Arts Center. James was different from the Arts Council leadership, younger, more progressive, and genuinely committed to expanding access to the arts. His institution had been one of the few to welcome my involvement from the beginning. "Sophia," his voice carried a note of urgency when I answered. "I just heard about your announcement. The entire cultural community is buzzing about it." "I imagine they are." "What's the general reaction?" "Mixed, as you'd expect. The old guard is terrified, the emerging professionals are excited, and everyone in between is trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing." James paused. "But I have to ask, are you sure about this approach? You're essentially declaring war on some very powerful people." "James, those powerful people declared war on me and everyone like me years ago. They just did it so subtly that we didn't recognize it as warfare. They called it maintaining standards and preserving excellence. But what they really meant was keeping outsiders out." "I understand your frustration, but do you?" I interrupted. "Do you really understand what it's like to be told that your PhD from Yale, your years of experience, your published research, and your genuine passion for the arts aren't enough to qualify you for volunteer work? Do you understand what it's like to watch less qualified people get opportunities simply because they went to the right schools or knew the right families? James was quiet for a moment. No, he admitted. I don't. I've benefited from connections and privileges that I didn't earn. But I also think there might be a way to change the system without destroying it entirely. The system has had decades to change itself, I replied. It's chosen preservation over progress every single time. Sometimes destruction is the only path to renewal. After ending the call with James, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what I was attempting. The Future of Arts Leadership Summit wasn't just a competing event, it was a manifesto, a declaration that the cultural sector needed new voices, new perspectives, and new approaches to leadership. Elena, I said, I want you to pull together a list of everyone who's been excluded from traditional arts leadership over the past 5 years. Museum professionals who were passed over for director positions. Curators who couldn't break into major institutions. Arts administrators who were told they lacked the right background for advancement. That's going to be a long list, Elena warned. Good. I want our summit to be a reunion of the excluded, a celebration of the overlooked, a platform for the voices that have been systematically silenced. My computer chimed again, this time with an email from Margaret Whitmore herself. The subject line was simply personal appeal, and the message was a far cry from the formal invitation I'd received that morning. Dear Sophia, it began, I hope you'll forgive the personal nature of this message, but I felt compelled to reach out to you directly. I've been reflecting on our conversation today, and I realize that the Arts Council may have made mistakes in our past interactions with you and other emerging professionals. The email continued for several paragraphs, acknowledging oversights in their volunteer selection process and expressing a desire to learn from past missteps. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to apologize without actually admitting wrongdoing. She's trying to rewrite history, Elena observed, reading over my shoulder, making it sound like your rejection was an unfortunate oversight rather than a deliberate decision based on their exclusionary criteria. Of course she is. It's easier to claim ignorance than to acknowledge complicity. I closed the email without responding. But the damage is done. They've revealed their true priorities, and now they have to live with the consequences. As the afternoon wore on, my phone continued to ring with calls from arts leaders, cultural journalists, and philanthropic organizations trying to understand the implications of my announcement. Each conversation revealed the same underlying tension: a cultural establishment that had grown comfortable with its exclusivity, suddenly confronted by someone who had the power to challenge their dominance. Ms. Chen Marcus appeared in my doorway again, this time carrying a stack of printed articles. The story is already hitting the media. The Times published a piece about your competing event, and the arts blogs are going crazy with speculation about what this means for the cultural sector. I scanned the headlines: Tech Entrepreneur Challenges Arts Establishment, the disruption of cultural philanthropy when the excluded become the excluders. The coverage was extensive and largely sympathetic to my position, but it also revealed the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. There's no going back now, I said, more to myself than to Marcus. Did you want to go back? Elena asked. I considered the question, thinking about the young woman who had applied to volunteer for the Arts Council Gala just 12 months ago. That woman had wanted nothing more than to be accepted into the cultural establishment, to be recognized as worthy of their attention and respect. But that woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had built her own platform, created her own opportunities, and accumulated enough power to reshape the very system that had rejected her. No, I said finally, I don't want to go back. I want to go forward toward a cultural sector that actually reflects the diversity and creativity of the communities it claims to serve. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Tomorrow, the real work would begin: building an alternative to the exclusionary system that had dominated arts leadership for too long. Tonight, I would savor the moment when the powerless had become powerful. When the excluded had become the excluders, when the invitation that came too late had revealed just how much the world had changed. The Arts Council had taught me an important lesson about power and privilege. Now it was my turn to teach them one about consequences and change. 3 weeks after my confrontation with the Arts Council leadership, I sat in my office reviewing RSVPs for the Future of Arts Leadership Summit. The response had been overwhelming, over 800 confirmed attendees, including museum directors from smaller institutions, emerging curators, community arts leaders, and cultural professionals who had been systematically excluded from traditional power structures. But it was the list of people who weren't attending that told the more interesting story. Marcus, I called to my assistant. Have we heard anything from the major cultural institutions about the summit? Radio silence from most of them, he replied, entering with his usual efficiency. Though I did get an interesting call from Dr. Patricia Williams at the Museum of Contemporary Culture. She wants to meet with you privately. Patricia Williams was different from the Arts Council leadership, younger, more progressive, and genuinely committed to institutional change. Her museum had been one of the few major institutions to embrace innovative programming and diverse leadership. If she wanted to meet, it was worth hearing what she had to say. Schedule it for this afternoon, I said. And Marcus, I want you to pull together everything we have on the Arts Council's financial situation. Sponsorship agreements, donor lists, budget projections. Are you planning something specific? I'm planning to understand exactly how much power we actually have in this situation. The financial analysis that arrived on my desk 2 hours later was illuminating. The Arts Council's budget had grown increasingly dependent on corporate sponsorships over the past 5 years, with traditional individual donors contributing a smaller percentage of their overall funding. My company's sponsorship agreements represented nearly 30% of their annual revenue, enough to make or break their programming for the year. But more interesting than the numbers was the pattern they revealed. The Arts Council had been struggling with declining relevance for years, their donor base aging and their programming failing to attract younger philanthropists. They had been trying to modernize their image while maintaining their exclusionary practices, a contradiction that was finally catching up with them. Dr. Williams is here, Marcus announced, showing Patricia into my office. Patricia Williams was in her 40s, with the kind of understated elegance that came from confidence rather than inheritance. She had built her reputation on innovative exhibitions and community engagement programs that had transformed her institution from a dusty repository into a vibrant cultural center. Sophia, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Thank you for seeing me. I know things have been complicated in the cultural community lately. Complicated is one way to put it, I agreed. What's your perspective on the situation? Honestly, I think you're doing something that needed to be done years ago. The cultural establishment has been resistant to change for too long, and sometimes disruption is the only way to force evolution. Her candor was refreshing. After weeks of diplomatic doublespeak from other cultural leaders. But, she continued, I'm also concerned about the potential for collateral damage. There are good people working within these institutions, people who are trying to create change from the inside. I'd hate to see them get caught in the crossfire. What are you suggesting? Patricia leaned forward, her expression serious. I'm suggesting that there might be a way to achieve your goals without completely destroying the existing system. What if we could create a pathway for institutional transformation rather than institutional replacement? I'm listening. The Arts Council is panicking right now. They know they've made mistakes and they're desperate to find a way forward that doesn't involve complete humiliation. What if we used that desperation as leverage for real change? I considered her proposal, intrigued despite my skepticism. What would that look like? A complete restructuring of their leadership model. New board composition requirements that prioritize expertise over connections. Transparent selection processes for all volunteer and leadership positions. Community input on programming and funding decisions. Basically, everything you've been advocating for, but implemented within the existing institutional framework. And do you think they'd agree to that? I think they'd agree to anything that allows them to survive with some dignity intact. The question is whether you'd be satisfied with transformation rather than replacement. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Elena Rodriguez. You need to see this. The Arts Council just announced their new diversity and inclusion initiative. They're claiming it was always part of their strategic plan. I showed the message to Patricia, who shook her head in disgust. They're trying to rewrite history, making it seem like your criticism inspired them to accelerate existing plans rather than forcing them to confront their failures. Typical, I said. But also revealing, if they're scrambling to appear progressive, it means they understand that the old model is no longer sustainable. Patricia's phone rang, and she glanced at the caller ID with surprise. It's Margaret Whitmore. Do you mind if I take this? I nodded, curious about what the Arts Council leadership might be saying to other cultural leaders behind the scenes. Margaret, Patricia answered, putting the call on speaker with my permission. What can I do for you? Patricia, thank God you're available. I need your help with a delicate situation. Margaret's voice carried a note of desperation that she was trying hard to conceal. I'm sure you've heard about our disagreement with Sophia Chen. I've heard something about it, Patricia replied carefully. The situation has gotten out of hand. Sophia is being completely unreasonable, refusing to engage in productive dialogue about our shared commitment to the arts. We need respected voices like yours to help mediate this conflict. I had to admire Margaret's skill at reframing the narrative. In her version, I was the unreasonable aggressor, disrupting the peaceful work of dedicated cultural leaders. What exactly are you asking me to do? Patricia asked. We're hoping you might speak with Sophia about the importance of institutional collaboration. Help her understand that destroying existing organizations won't advance the cause of arts accessibility. Margaret, Patricia said, her voice growing firmer, have you considered that maybe Sophia's criticism is valid? That maybe the Arts Council needs to examine its own practices rather than asking others to manage the consequences of those practices? The silence on the other end of the line was telling. I'm not sure what you mean, Margaret finally said. I mean that Sophia Chen applied to volunteer for your organization and was rejected despite having exceptional qualifications. I mean that your leadership structure has been exclusionary for decades. I mean that maybe this conflict is an opportunity for self-reflection rather than damage control. Patricia, I'm surprised to hear you taking this position. The Arts Council has always been supportive of your work. The Arts Council has been supportive of my work because my institution brings prestige to your events and credibility to your mission. But that's very different from being supportive of systemic change or inclusive leadership. Margaret's tone shifted, becoming cooler and more formal. I see. Well, I hope you'll reconsider your position. The cultural community needs unity right now, not division. After Margaret hung up, Patricia and I sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications of what we'd just heard. She's calling everyone, Patricia said finally, trying to build a coalition against you, framing this as a conflict between stability and chaos rather than between exclusion and inclusion. How successful do you think she'll be? Less successful than she hopes, but more successful than you might expect. There are a lot of people in the cultural community who benefit from the status quo, even if they don't actively support its exclusionary aspects. I pulled up the guest list for the Arts Council's upcoming gala, cross-referencing it with the attendee list for our summit. The overlap was minimal. We were essentially creating parallel cultural communities. One rooted in tradition and privilege, the other in innovation and inclusion. Patricia, I said, what if we're approaching this wrong? What if the goal isn't to reform the existing system or replace it, but to demonstrate that there's a better alternative? What do you mean? I mean that maybe the most powerful statement we can make is to show what cultural leadership looks like when it's actually diverse, innovative, and community-focused. Let the Arts Council continue with their traditional model and let the results speak for themselves. Patricia smiled for the first time since entering my office. A competition of ideas rather than a battle for control. Exactly. We'll host our summit, they'll host their gala, and the cultural community can decide which vision of leadership they want to support. As Patricia prepared to leave, she turned back with one final observation. Sophia, you realize that what you're doing goes beyond just challenging the Arts Council. You're challenging the entire model of how cultural institutions operate, how they select leaders, how they define success. I know, I said. And it's about time. After she left, I found myself thinking about the young woman who had applied to volunteer for the Arts Council Gala just over a year ago. That woman had wanted to be accepted into their world, to be recognized as worthy of their attention and respect. But in rejecting her application, they had inadvertently created something much more powerful, a competitor who understood their weaknesses, who had built her own platform, and who was now in a position to offer the cultural community a genuine alternative to their exclusionary model. The invitation that had come too late had revealed more than just their desperation. It had revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what cultural leadership required in the 21st century. And now, in just 3 weeks, the world would see the difference between leadership based on privilege and leadership based on purpose. The night of the competing events arrived with the kind of dramatic tension that would have been perfect for a theatrical production. Across the city, two visions of cultural leadership were about to be tested in real time. The Arts Council's traditional gala at the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Hotel and our Future of Arts Leadership Summit at the Contemporary Arts Center. I stood in the main gallery of the Contemporary Arts Center, watching as our guests arrived for what had become the most anticipated cultural event of the year. The contrast with traditional galas was immediately apparent instead of formal evening wear and careful social positioning. Our attendees wore everything from business suits to artistic ensembles that reflected their creative spirits. Sophia Elena Rodriguez approached with a tablet full of real-time updates. The registration numbers are incredible. We have 847 confirmed attendees, including representatives from 23 countries and every major city in North America. What about media coverage? Unprecedented. CNN is live streaming both events for comparison. The Times has reporters at both venues. And the arts publications are treating this like the cultural equivalent of a presidential election. Through the gallery's large windows, I could see the Meridian Hotel across the plaza, its ballroom glowing with the warm light of crystal chandeliers and the soft murmur of polite conversation. The Arts Council's gala was proceeding according to its traditional script: cocktails, dinner, speeches, and the careful choreography of high society philanthropy. Any word from the Arts Council about how their event is going? I asked. Attendance is down about 30% from last year, Elena reported. Several major donors chose to attend our summit instead, and a number of cultural institutions sent representatives here rather than there. The defections weren't entirely surprising. Over the past 3 weeks, as word of our summit had spread through the cultural community, many people had quietly expressed their support for our vision of inclusive leadership. The Arts Council's attempt to frame the conflict as stability versus chaos had backfired, instead highlighting their resistance to necessary change. Dr. Chen, a young woman, approached with obvious excitement. Maria Santos, a graduate student in museum studies at Columbia. I wanted to thank you for creating this opportunity. I've been trying to break into the cultural sector for 2 years, and this is the first event where I've felt like my ideas and perspectives were actually valued. What kind of work are you hoping to do? I asked. Community engagement programming, specifically focused on making museums more accessible to immigrant families. I've developed some innovative approaches, but traditional institutions keep telling me that my ideas are too experimental or not aligned with their institutional culture. Have you considered that maybe their institutional culture is the problem, not your ideas? Maria's smile was radiant. That's exactly what I realized when I heard about your summit. Maybe the solution isn't to change myself to fit their expectations, but to find or create institutions that share my values. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation after conversation with cultural professionals who had similar talented, innovative people who had been excluded from traditional leadership opportunities because they didn't fit the narrow mold of what cultural leaders were supposed to look like. Sophia, Dr. James Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, approached with a group of museum directors from smaller institutions. We've been discussing your presentation about alternative funding models, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in piloting some of these approaches with our institutions. What did you have in mind? Community-controlled cultural programming, instead of boards dominated by wealthy donors making decisions about what art should be displayed or what programs should be offered. We'd create mechanisms for community members to have direct input into institutional priorities. The proposal was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that traditional cultural institutions had been resistant to, but it represented the future of community-engaged arts programming. I'd be very interested in supporting that kind of pilot program, I said. Let's set up a meeting next week to discuss the details. As the summit continued, I became increasingly aware of the energy in the room, the excitement of people who felt heard, valued, and empowered to shape the future of their field. This was what cultural leadership could look like when it was actually inclusive and innovative. Ms. Chen. Marcus appeared at my side with an urgent expression. You have a call from Margaret Whitmore. She says it's important. I stepped into a quiet corner of the gallery and answered the call, curious about what the Arts Council leadership might want to discuss in the middle of their own event. Sophia, Margaret's voice was strained, lacking its usual diplomatic polish. I'm calling to ask if we might arrange a meeting tomorrow. There are some things we need to discuss. What kind of things? The future of cultural philanthropy in this city. The sustainability of our respective organizations. The possibility of finding common ground. I could hear the desperation beneath her diplomatic language. The Arts Council's gala was clearly not going as planned, and they were beginning to understand the long-term implications of the cultural shift that was occurring. Margaret, I thought you made your position clear 3 weeks ago. You wanted me to serve as honorary chair to legitimize your traditional approach to cultural leadership. I declined, and I offered an alternative vision. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed, Margaret replied, her voice growing more urgent. The cultural landscape is shifting, and we need to find a way to work together rather than in opposition. You mean you need to find a way to survive the consequences of your exclusionary practices? There was a long pause before Margaret responded. Yes, she said finally. That's exactly what I mean. The admission was startling in its honesty. For the first time in our interactions, Margaret had dropped her diplomatic facade and acknowledged the reality of their situation. What are you proposing? I asked. A merger. The Arts Council and Meridian Cultural Enterprises, working together to create a new model of cultural leadership that combines institutional experience with innovative approaches. Under whose leadership? Another pause. We're open to discussing governance structures that reflect the new realities of cultural philanthropy. I almost laughed at the euphemistic language. What she was really saying was that they were willing to cede control to me in exchange for survival. Margaret, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in legitimizing your organization by association. If you want to change your practices, you're free to do so, but you don't need my permission or my participation. Sophia, please. The cultural community needs stability. If we continue on this path of division and competition, everyone will suffer. The cultural community needs accountability, I corrected. It needs leadership that reflects its diversity. It needs institutions that serve their communities rather than their own interests. If that creates instability for organizations that have been resistant to change, then maybe that instability is necessary. After ending the call, I returned to the summit. But my mind was processing the implications of Margaret's desperate offer. The Arts Council's willingness to discuss a merger revealed just how dramatically the power dynamics had shifted in the cultural sector. How was the call? Alina asked, noting my thoughtful expression. Illuminating. They're panicking enough to offer a merger, which means they understand that their traditional model is no longer sustainable. Are you considering it? Not for a second. The whole point of this summit is to demonstrate that we don't need to reform existing institutions. We can create better alternatives. As the evening wound down and our guests began making their way home, I reflected on what we had accomplished. The future of arts leadership. Summit hadn't just been an event, it had been a demonstration of what cultural leadership could look like when it was actually inclusive, innovative, and community-focused. Across the plaza, the lights were dimming in the Meridian Hotel's ballroom as the Arts Council's gala came to its traditional conclusion. But here in the Contemporary Arts Center, conversations were continuing, connections were being made, and plans were being developed for a cultural sector that looked very different from the one that had rejected my volunteer application just over a year ago. The invitation that had come too late had revealed more than just their desperation. It had revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what cultural leadership required in the 21st century. And now, as the excluded became the empowered, the cultural community was about to discover what happened when merit mattered more than money, when innovation trumped tradition, and when the future was shaped by those who had been systematically excluded from the past. 6 months after the competing events that had split the cultural community, I stood in the newly opened Meridian Center for Cultural Innovation, watching as our first cohort of emerging arts leaders presented their community engagement projects to a packed auditorium. The transformation had been more dramatic and more rapid than even I had anticipated. The Arts Council's traditional gala had indeed been their last. Within 2 months of that fateful evening, 3 major donors had withdrawn their support, citing concerns about the organization's resistance to necessary modernization. The Metropolitan Museum had quietly ended its partnership with the council, and several smaller institutions had followed suit. Margaret Whitmore had resigned as volunteer coordinator, and Harrison Blackwood had stepped down as chairman. But the collapse of the old system had created space for something better to emerge. Sophia, Dr. Alina Rodriguez approached with a folder full of applications. We have 347 candidates for next year's Cultural Leadership Fellowship program. The selection committee is going to have some difficult decisions to make. The fellowship program was one of several initiatives that had grown out of the Future of Arts Leadership Summit. Instead of relying on traditional gatekeepers to identify and develop cultural leaders, we had created a merit-based system that prioritized innovation, community engagement, and demonstrated impact over social connections and inherited privilege. Any applications from people who were involved with the old Arts Council leadership, I asked? Actually, yes. Victoria Ashworth submitted a proposal for a community-based arts education program. It's quite good, actually shows a real understanding of the principles we've been advocating. I wasn't entirely surprised. In the months following the cultural upheaval, several former Arts Council leaders had quietly reached out to explore opportunities for involvement in our new initiatives. Some, like Victoria, seemed genuinely committed to learning and changing. Others appeared to be motivated primarily by a desire to remain relevant in the transformed cultural landscape. Schedule her for an interview, I said, but make sure she understands that any position would be based on merit, not on her previous connections or status. Of course, though I have to say, it's interesting to see how quickly some people can adapt when their survival depends on it. Through the center's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the cultural district that had once seemed so inaccessible and exclusive. Many of the same buildings housed the same institutions, but the power dynamics had shifted fundamentally. Museums were experimenting with community-controlled programming. Galleries were showcasing artists who had been systematically excluded from traditional exhibition spaces. Theater companies were developing works that reflected the diversity of their actual communities rather than the preferences of their wealthy patrons. Ms. Chen, a young man, approached with obvious excitement. I'm David Kim, one of this year's fellowship recipients. I wanted to thank you for creating this opportunity, but I also wanted to share something that I think you'll find interesting. He handed me a printed email, explaining, "This is from the director of the Contemporary Arts Museum. They're offering me a curator position, the same position I applied for 2 years ago and was told I wasn't qualified for." I read the email, which was effusive in its praise for David's innovative vision and fresh perspective on contemporary art. The irony was palpable. His qualifications hadn't changed, but the cultural sector's willingness to recognize those qualifications had been transformed by the pressure for institutional change. "Are you going to accept the position?" I asked. "I'm considering it, but I want to make sure that any institution I work with is genuinely committed to change, not just trying to appear progressive to avoid criticism." That's exactly the right question to ask. What would convince you of their genuine commitment? Concrete changes to their governance structure, their programming priorities, their hiring practices, evidence of systemic change, not just symbolic gestures. David's response reflected the sophistication that had emerged among the new generation of cultural leaders. They understood that real change required more than just diverse hiring. It required fundamental shifts in how institutions operated, how they made decisions, and how they defined success. "Dr. Chen?" Another voice interrupted our conversation. I turned to see Patricia Williams, the museum director who had tried to mediate between me and the Arts Council leadership 6 months earlier. Her expression suggested she had important news to share. "Patricia, good to see you. How are things at the Museum of Contemporary Culture?" "Transformative, actually. We've implemented many of the governance changes you advocated for, and the results have been remarkable. Community engagement is up 200%. Our programming is more innovative than it's ever been, and we're attracting younger, more diverse audiences." "I'm glad to hear it. What brings you here today?" "I wanted to discuss a proposal that I think might interest you. Several of us who run mid-sized cultural institutions have been talking about creating a formal network, a coalition of organizations committed to the new model of inclusive, community-focused cultural leadership." The proposal was intriguing. Instead of trying to reform the existing cultural establishment, we could create a parallel network of institutions that operated according to different principles and priorities. What would this network look like in practice? Shared resources, collaborative programming, joint advocacy for policy changes that support community-engaged arts programming. Basically, we'd formalize the relationships that have been developing organically since your summit. And governance. Democratic decision-making with representation based on community impact rather than institutional size or budget. The kind of structure that reflects our values rather than traditional hierarchies. As Patricia outlined her vision for the network, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. 18 months ago, I had been a struggling arts administrator whose volunteer application had been rejected by the very people who now sought my approval and partnership. The transformation had been dramatic, but it had also been necessary. Sophia Alina approached with her tablet. "I have the final attendance numbers from today's presentations." We had representatives from 47 cultural institutions, 23 community organizations, and 15 international arts programs. The interest in our model is spreading globally. The global interest wasn't entirely surprising. The challenges we had faced in our local cultural community, exclusionary leadership, resistance to change, disconnect between institutions and communities, were common problems in cultural sectors around the world. Any international partnership opportunities. The British Arts Council wants to pilot our fellowship program in London. The Toronto Cultural Alliance is interested in our community engagement model. And we've had inquiries from arts organizations in Berlin, São Paulo, and Sydney. As the day's events wound down and our guests began making their way home, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. The rejection that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been a gift. It had forced me to build something better rather than trying to reform something broken. Chen. David Kim approached one final time, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about our earlier conversation, and I wanted to ask you something. Do you ever regret not accepting the Arts Council's invitation to serve as honorary chair? I considered the question, thinking about the path not taken. If I had accepted their invitation, I would have become complicit in legitimizing their exclusionary system. I would have provided them with the diverse face they needed to maintain their traditional practices without fundamental change. No, I said finally. Accepting their invitation would have been accepting their definition of success, their understanding of what cultural leadership should look like. By declining, I was able to demonstrate that there was a better alternative. But wasn't there a risk that your alternative might fail? That you might end up with less influence than you would have had working within their system? There's always a risk in choosing transformation over accommodation, I agreed. But there's also a greater risk in accepting systems that are fundamentally unjust, even if they offer you a place at the table. As I prepared to leave the Meridian Center for Cultural Innovation, I took one last look around the space that had become a symbol of what was possible when cultural leadership was actually inclusive, innovative, and community-focused. The walls were lined with artwork created by artists who had been excluded from traditional gallery spaces. The programming reflected the diversity of the communities we served. The leadership structure prioritized expertise and impact over connections and privilege. The invitation that had come too late had revealed more than just the Arts Council's desperation. It had revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what cultural leadership required in the 21st century. They had assumed that power was something to be hoarded rather than shared, that excellence was something to be preserved rather than expanded, that change was something to be resisted rather than embraced. But in rejecting their invitation, I had discovered something more valuable than their acceptance: the ability to create institutions that reflected my values rather than compromising those values to gain access to their institutions. 6 months later, the cultural landscape had been transformed. The excluded had become the empowered, the marginalized had become the mainstream, and the future was being shaped by those who had been systematically excluded from the past. Sometimes, the most powerful response to an invitation is the refusal to accept it on the terms offered, and the courage to create something better instead.